Are we going?
We're trying the thing. See if we
Okay.
hear sound.
hmm Perfect.
We're trying the thing. See if we
Okay.
hear sound.
'Cause that feedback loop from my. Oh,
All right, friends. Hopefully you are hearing some sort of sound at some point, but we still continue to try. Um,
we do.
Getting a little bit of the production side of this like organized and brought in. But good morning and welcome to another episode of the Unifying Force. I'm Dave.
Hey, I'm Gio. How's everyone doing?
And as you know, Catherine is generally with us. Catherine is traveling a little bit this weekend, and she may be popping in, she may not. But we are going to discuss fan topic, okay? This was brought to us at the end of last week's episode. So, what we're talking about today is we're going to be discussing the Jedi. And specifically, in discussing the Jedi, we're going to be talking about, do we really think the Jedi are keepers of the peace? Or are they just straight up warriors? So, Gio, why don't you give us first thoughts?
Okay. Thank you. So, it's a good spiritual sequel to the previous discussion we had on what makes the Jedi, their identity and who they are. Last time we looked at how there's two kind of broad ways of classifying them into maybe a religious group or a spiritual order. And this time we can go more into the kind of spiritual, metaphysical versus the physical, real world um, identity of a warrior group. And so we're looking at the Jedi because this is the unifying force. And we can just pose that question to ourselves. Are they um, identifying primarily as people to keep the peace, guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic, in the Republic, in the Star Wars galaxy, or do some of them identify more as warriors, and then us as fans, as observers, do we feel they fit more into one than the other, or maybe they're a blend, and if so, what kind of blend is it? Kind of 60-40. So that's what we want to discuss and get into. Last time we touched on how there are great parallels in our world and in our galaxy with what we see on screen and in the saga, both inside the expanded universe. So that's what we now call legends, the additional supplementary material in graphic novels, video games, books, and also now in the canon that we have with Disney Plus and the extra TV shows and all the additional material that Lucasfilm is providing us and expanding the universe again, once again. So, my first thing would be let's go into what is a warrior and what does it mean to be a peacekeeper. Um, so, for me, I'll just keep it very simply that a peacekeeper is somebody who wants to preserve a sense of calm, a sense of non-war state in the immediate environment, maybe in the wider experience of things. So for a Jedi, that would be to maintain a peaceful time, a peaceful status quo where there is no conflict, no harm, and no war. While a warrior, by name itself, is somebody who is directly related to war, and the very identity is that of wartime. An individual who specializes in combat, in warfare, either as an institution or a profession, a vocation. So It's something often they are chosen for or they choose to be. And it might be related to a particular culture within a hierarchy or within a community. And so for Star Wars and the Jedi, you see it's the formal institution of the Jedi Order that we discussed in good detail last time, being a physical body, um, analogous to maybe a church or a religious group that we might have in our world. And then within that, you have the individuals who operate on their own spectra of how much they commit to a particular code and particular philosophies, and whether they're widely acknowledged and held, or are they a little bit more of a pariah and a rogue, such as Qui-Gon Jinn, who is more on the spiritual path than the religious orthodoxy. And so for the Jedi, I think every individual we could go into discussing in terms of character, who is further along the kind of band between just a traditional peacekeeper who wants to be totally pacifist and a warrior who acknowledges that sometimes specializing in combat and martial arts and the strategy of war is needed to preserve the peace. So
So my kind of
yeah.
starting take, excuse me, is
Okay.
my kind of starting take is to examine kind of like where this question I assume comes from, like in canon, is in, I believe it's episode 4, or the original, the Star Wars, is Obi-Wan, mentioned the Jedi kept the peace for thousands of years, and very specifically in the real episode 1, the Phantom Menace, I think that is it episode 1? It may or it might have been 2. Is that Mace Windu literally says to Palpatine, "Is the Jedi, we're keepers of the peace. We're not."
Soldiers. Yeah.
Yeah, is he literally says that, and so we can go down the road of thinking, is this what the Jedi think of themselves, or is this just what just they think of themselves? Does the world at large perceive them in the same way? Or I think there probably are instances later in the Clone Wars series where we see that they're not. Um, Obviously they have the skill to be warriors. They're trained to be warriors from the beginning. Oh, I think we've got Catherine coming in. Excellent. Um, they obviously have the skill to be warriors, but how are they perceived themselves as a group? How are they perceived by the rest of the galaxy? In that same sort of way.
Yeah, that's a really good way of framing it and summarizing what I began to ramble on. I think if we go, the starting point was always good for me. I think if we look at on screen in the original saga, in the main body of films, and exactly the line that resonated with me and came to my mind when I heard this question from the previous time was Mace Windu's genuinely saying, "We're keepers of the peace, not soldiers." And it's a very defiant line and encapsulates everything that the conflict of the stars is about, because it seems that the central power, wherever that may be, lies in who's controlling star systems, and are they going to be free, or are they going to be part of a conflict for freedom away from tyranny? And then if you're going to escape tyranny, often in Star Wars history and in actual history, it's a struggle that unfortunately entails, as a final resort to those who have a particular code or philosophy of peace, using martial arts and skill. Hi, Catherine. Welcome.
No, no.
Using the knowledge of martial arts, of warfare, whether they are trained in it or not, as a means of escape, as a final resort, to stand up for equality, freedom, peace, and justice. And it seems that George Lucas very clearly in the episodes 1 to 3 wanted to establish that the Jedi had a particular set way as an institution and a body, that was ideally going for this peacekeeping maintenance of what seemed to be an equitable status quo, which is a galactic republic with as many systems as possible who want to be joining, who are in theory meant to be free systems, but abide by, I guess, a galactic constitution, have some commonalities. They can trade with each other and visit one another and work together and build a galactic community. The Jedi end up becoming um, a military arm to protect the status quo, which
And I
sounds,
think it's
yeah,
really interesting that you bring in the bringing in of other star systems there, because if you look beyond the quote that we're talking about in what Mace says, what Palpatine is talking about at the same time as more systems join the Separatists. So
mm,
they're looking at, that's what Palpatine's talking about when Mace says that,
yeah,
is that, as more join the Separatists, that it may lead to war. So my question, kind of, and Catherine, we can get you to chime in on this one as well, that is Mace really discussing a philosophy? Or is he just kind of telling Palpatine, it's like, look, the war is coming, but we don't have enough people to be an army. And this comes up again when Qui-Gon is talking to Padme or
yeah,
Queen Amidala as officially. It's like, we're here to protect you. I can't fight a war for you. Is he
mm,
talking about their numbers and what they've got, or is it the philosophy? I think it could be interpreted either way. What do you think, Catherine?
I think that it's like in Mace Windu's case, he's telling the Chancellor that, look, you may feel we're getting near to war, but that's not what we're intending to do. He wants to avoid that at all costs, and is stressing that we're supposed to keep the peace. We can go do your negotiations and stuff like that, but we don't want you to just pick war as like a first avenue to deal with this. Whereas with Qui-Gon, he's like, look, Your Majesty, I don't know what you're planning here, but I'm not going to go to war for you because that's not exactly what our job is. It's like, yes, if you do this, it's like he says in the climax, he is willing to have himself and Obi-Wan protect the queen during the course of events. But he says, I cannot get like headstrong and lead this war for you. It's like, whereas in the beginning of that film, he was fine rescuing the queen because they were in danger and they are keepers of the peace. So he did that, but it's not like he's going to volunteer to be the general to run on the battlefield. Whereas fast forward 10 years later, and because of the way in which the Clone Wars sort of start kind of out of the blue, effectively starting with a rescue mission, with Mace Windu leading all the 200 Jedi to save Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Padme, and then their failure to stop Dooku. It's like, well, now the war's kind of going into full swing. Because Yoda, of course, went to go get the clones because he needed backup to rescue Obi-Wan and Anakin. It wasn't so much that he was gung-ho about, okay, let's go to war and all that. And even Obi-Wan told Anakin when they were pursuing Dooku, he's like, look, if we catch him, we can end the war right now. Or in other words, there won't be a war if we could deal with this. But
yeah,
once they failed that, it's like the cat was out of the bag and they were kind of stuck. But I think more or less it's like they would prefer to not be warriors. They would prefer to just be your aggressive negotiators, your defenders, and they would stick with a more spiritual philosophy of being peacekeepers, but would try and avoid war at all costs. Now, of course, we know even from expanded universe and canon, they fought wars with the Sith, which makes sense because those are their arch enemy, and they fought wars with the Mandalorians because the Mandalorians were like locusts and they needed to force try and stop them. But it seems by the time we get to the prequels, they're more inclined. They keep saying that they're not going to do this, but they kind of can easily get pushed into it anyway.
mm,
Yeah, absolutely. Is I mean, the first thing that we see really in canon in the prequels is Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon going on a diplomatic mission to for negotiation, right? Is they're set up, and then they're going into this in full faith that there will be negotiations when the separatists try and kill them. And immediately the hesitation is they're down to go to war at that point,
mm.
but that would be how they are portrayed to begin with.
Yeah, it very quickly escalates from what seems to be an ambassadorial role as negotiators in a trade deal, which sounds very economic, political, and nothing necessarily requiring a physical force. But then their lives are immediately threatened. And yet, the good thing is that I guess the Trade Federation, because they are entirely reliant on battle droids, on non-sentient, non-organic living things to be their machines of war, quite literally. It makes it clear that Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon aren't bringing violence to other life. They're defending themselves from the battle droids, from the droidicas, and they're not taking open aggressive actions against the Neimoidian leaders that are on the Trade Federation battleship, whom they're probably fully aware are around and are controlling these hive-minded droids from afar. So I think whether that was an intentional narrative choice or not, the Jedi, in defending themselves from the very beginning of the prequel trilogy, are seen to only ignite their lightsabers as a last resort for a quick escape, for a quick preservation of their own life, and never in hostility or in open aggression. And it does remind me of the kind of generic medieval kind of Western European idea of a knight, and how the sword should always be in the scabbard, sheathed up. At the moment one draws their sword, that's an open act of violence, an aggression, which will encourage hostility from those around you, and inspire fear, unfortunately, in those who aren't able to defend themselves. So I see that parallel quite clearly as a visual reminder that the Jedi, only at the end of their negotiations and when their ambassador roles have not been to completion, or they cannot fulfill their duties as negotiators and people who extend the olive branch, then the sword is drawn, but only at the end.
And I think you might have actually stumbled on another topic that would be good for another show, is the argument of the sentience or not sentience of droids and how they are treated in the Star Wars universe, and whether that being an allegory to, slavery. So
Oh, definitely.
I think you've stumbled on another, kind of topic that George kind of slid in there a little
Yeah,
bit that
yeah.
not everybody sees. So,
Mm,
maybe look for that on a future episode.
will do.
But yeah, is they start off that way, but I think we've discussed, and we discussed last week, is how the Jedi, they're thinking that they're here, but then it's a slippery slope, and how the Jedi Order kind of slides into something else,
Mm, yeah,
and they're definitely, by even accepting the titles of general of the clone army and that sort of thing, is they're sliding into that sort of warrior and almost warmongering culture.
yeah,
um in
yeah.
that, as is, I'll submit this that I alluded to a little bit earlier, is if you look at, I think it's season 7 of the Clone Wars, when Ahsoka is, leaves the Jedi Order and she's going down to kind of the underworld of Coruscant, and she meets the sisters whose names escape me at the moment. Is, those sisters of, their, how they perceive the Jedi is not remotely close to what, we as viewers might be perceiving the Jedi as at that point. So what do we think on that, Catherine, Gio?
Well, they never really did answer the question as to why the Jedi became generals anyway. It's like I could see in the instance of the Battle of Geonosis that it makes sense because they're mounting a rescue mission, but afterwards they never really did dive into it, because the clones obviously are programmed to be like, some of them are generals, others are captains, and or lieutenants or colonels or whatever. So there was really no reason for them to do that. It just sort of happened, and I guess the Chancellor just felt that it was, of course, because Darth Sidious is the Chancellor, he sees that it is very fitting for his scheme to let the Jedi be the generals because they'll be the ones taking the heat for this. Uh, but from the Jedi's perspective, it doesn't really make sense as to why they're willing to do this. Maybe it's that, oh, well, we know a Sith is leading the enemy, so technically this is a Jedi Sith issue type thing, maybe. But they do kind of slip into that without really ever addressing the reasons why.
Hmm. It's a good way to have an alternative perspective, because those characters, the Martez sisters, they are on the periphery and obviously not necessarily taking an open side in anything. One could say there was a term that was used in the expanded universe for characters that weren't siding with one or the other kind of light or dark power factions, and they just call them fringe. So people who are genuinely on the periphery, on the outside, looking in, and their perspectives will be fresher and different to people within the Republic, the Separatists, the Empire, and the Rebel Alliance. And I think it shows that whatever perspective the Jedi have on themselves and their identity during the Clone Wars era is in dissonance with what the galaxy at large might see the Jedi to be. And that could be for numerous reasons, but what we see later on when it's the dark times and the Empire in ascendancy between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, the Jedi are maligned by the kind of corporations and the galactic holonet and the media that the Empire controls, because there is a censorship of, I guess, free, independent thinking, and it's essentially the Imperial way or not. There's no alternative, which is why the struggle for the Rebel Alliance ties in very well with the original ethos of the Jedi, which is protectors of peace and justice, and essentially freedom. Now, one area that you could argue, we want to be very pedantic, is in the opening crawl for the Star Wars films, the Jedi are described a couple of times in a little short line as guardians of peace and justice in the Republic, or the Old Republic. And it's a phrase that recurs throughout the films and throughout the wider material. They say peace and justice. They don't always say freedom. And I am wanting to add freedom onto that and talk about liberty. But if we look at the way the Jedi Order became internally corrupt and blinded by being rebranded as generals in a galactic war for the Galactic Republic, and there didn't seem to be too much dissent from taking that role up in the films. At least in the Clone Wars, there's a lot more detail and more background, and the fleshing out of characters, including the main Jedi that we wanted to know more about during the prequel films we received. And Ahsoka is a great reflection of conflict between Obi-Wan and Anakin in a third party. And that's what I see those sisters as well, in the way that Ahsoka gave the fresh alternative perspective as like a young, naive, maybe teenage apprentice to Anakin from the beginning of the Clone Wars. You have these sisters now being not necessarily naive, but a fresher external take on the way the Jedi are perceived, and how one's identity isn't necessarily exactly what others perceive one's identity to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
Catherine. I don't know if you'd be able to throw the term freedom on there, because they clearly aren't bothered by all the slavery in the galaxy, at least not at the timeline of the prequels.
Yeah. That's why I was adding it on as my perspective and my take, but then I realized it's actually not mentioned much. And if you look at the kind of orthodox Jedi that become kind of away from the way they were spiritually meant to be, as a simple spiritual pathway for people to improve themselves and improve the galaxy, then yeah, if you are protecting the status quo and the Galactic Republic, but then not everybody has equality in the Old Republic or in the Galactic Republic, then you no longer are you a defender of freedom, really. But that's another huge kind of parallel conversation to have. I think in terms of the warrior aspect, it seems, in summary to me, in the prequel era, it was a reluctant uptaking of the role of becoming soldiers and generals in the war. Some Jedi potentially thought nothing of it, and this is my duty to protect the galaxy. Yes, but that could be from indoctrination from childhood and a kind of automaton robotic, yes, sir, thank you, sir. I will protect the Republic. It is my duty. And similarly, how in various warrior traditions and even in modern day militarism and the life of soldiers. Some people simply are content with the establishment and the idea of this is the role, these are the objectives, these are my missions, and that's what I'm paid to do, hired to do, or perhaps one might come from a military family or background and feel their lineage makes them inherently want to serve in that particular way, and perhaps the Jedi had this too. Only, as we know in the more recent saga era of the Jedi, they had a couple of very sketchy practices, such as no family of your own and only finding young, impressionable children across the galaxy to then bring into the order, which is, morally very dubious.
Yeah, it is, and that may lead to some of the impressions that the galaxy as a whole has of them, because does the galaxy as a whole know that these Padawans are there, maybe not of their own volition, but at least, voluntarily from their family? Is there, at the they're perceived as slaves by the galaxy, or at the very least indentured servitude?
Yeah.
Is do they know that they had a choice in coming into this?
Probably not.
I wouldn't think so.
Because they're so young. They're not, because it's kind of like the parents sit down, they decide they're going to have a kid for whatever reason, and it suddenly has force powers. And because of how starstruck they are by the Jedi and the Jedi's just status in the Republic, showing up at their doorstep wanting their kid, they're just so excited and get stars in their eyes, and they're like, "Here, take my kid," type thing. But the kids too, and the reason they want them that young is because kids that are young aren't really going to process what's going on. They're not necessarily going to miss their parents.
Right. Or is it an issue with that? I can imagine that a child with force powers would create difficulty and problems integrating into society. It's could be an allegory for a child that develops differently, and you take them out in public, and they're all of a sudden beaming using the force to grab the Fruit Loops off the shelf, and everybody else is sitting there going, "Whoa!"
That's the sales pitch. Come to the Jedi Temple, Xavier's School for the Gifted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly right there, and we know full well that's been well documented. How the X-Men has been a parallel, and we're not going to go down that road. This is Star Wars talk.
Yeah.
But
back to the Yoda School of Witchcraft and Wizardry.
Yes, exactly. There you go. A question from the chat we have coming in is it that it could there be that with multiple contributors to the Star Wars universe, in Legends, in the EU, even in the writing for the sequel trilogies and all of those sort of things, because we're talking about, Padawans at this point, we could be talking about Broom Boy and whatnot. Would the role of the Jedi been perceived differently and maybe fleshed out with either way, more peacekeepers or warriors, if George had been the only contributor, if George had been the only one in charge of what their roles would be?
Well, in the prequels he was, whereas in 5 and 6 he allowed more, deviation for Kazdan and Kirshner and the other guy, Marquand.
Yeah.
But
and
prequels
Lee
is
Brackett
more
as well.
But I think we were talking about even beyond into, Clone Wars. The entire Clone Wars saga is Filoni. It's not George. It's who admittedly studied at the feet of George, but it's Filoni. We're talking about things in the EU. Would there have been something more clear cut and dried if George were it?
Possibly.
Well, he would chair a lot of the meetings for the storylines on Clone Wars, in terms of like telling Dave, like, here's the story, here's what this is, here's what that is, and some of them he was more involved with. Others, like the Mortis trilogy, George was a lot more hands-on that one. So it's kind of difficult to say who had total autonomy over it, but you do get that they don't, even in the Clone Wars series, they don't do too much of a deep dive into those ideas. Like, is it Xavier's School for the Gifted, or is it like a like a military school type thing? Hey, your kid needs to come with us, and we're going to coax you into doing it, even if you feel bad about it, or like that episode of Clone Wars when Cad Bane goes undercover as a Jedi to try and kidnap kids, and he goes to this lady's house on Rhodia, and she's really upset, and she's like, "Oh, I didn't, Master Rapal said he wasn't going to have to go for a few more years," and I'm thinking, if you're already this upset about it, then you're going to be infinitely more upset about it if you waited a few years. And Master
Yeah.
Rapal probably should have picked up on that. Like the actual
Yeah.
Master Rapal should pick up that, okay, you're probably not going to be a good candidate if you're already this attached, you know?
Mm.
But are they pushing it anyway? Like, that's the thing. You don't really know. It'd be an interesting avenue to explore in like a comic or a book or another show.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Alternative
it
timeline.
would be, because you're talking about that's what led Anakin down the path to the dark side, was his attachment. Are they waiting at some cases too long? And what do you do with someone who's showing force abilities, who has that attachment? What happens to them? Do they stay with their parents, and are they in regular society and don't join the order? We've gotten, I mean, ultimately, it also leads to the path of the dark side is Dooku's attachment to his original family, that he found later in life. Spoiler alert. But, you know, it's very interesting type of things. Now, I'll answer this question in that, in some research for this show, as I've found an interview with the Master, with George himself, who clearly says the Jedi are keepers of the peace. They are there to be negotiators and to maintain. So, if you're just going from a point of view of what the Godfather says, that's it. Now, you can, of course, question, well, then why did you do this in the prequel trilogy, and why did you do this to them and allow them to become these generals of the Republic? But again, it could be argued still that that's some of what Palpatine's genius is in corrupting that by, did he himself declare them generals of the Republic, the clone army? So was there, let's get this back to an actual question. Was the Jedi's fall into being warriors, or evolution into being more of a warrior type culture, due to the corruption of the Sith, of Palpatine?
You could say what we see in the saga, it appears that way. If we didn't have the earlier chronology from the expanded universe, the EU and Legends. Now, I know some of that is up for debate in terms of what's officially the story in canon now or not. But if we're exclusively looking at the information we're given about the Jedi from the beginning of the Phantom Menace through into Attack of the Clones, and then widely in the Clone Wars series, you could definitely say that Palpatine is perhaps the greatest contributing factor to the corruption of the Jedi from their original precept of a spiritual, peaceful order, because their identity becomes so differentiated from their code, not necessarily just strictly the Jedi code, but their moral code, their ethics, that even the Mara sisters in Coruscant, or other peripheral characters that aren't in the crux of the political debate or the war, don't see the Jedi as the selfless, noble, heroic savior characters that perhaps some of the Jedi think they are, and Anakin certainly saw in Qui-Gon when he saw his laser sword on Tatooine the first time. And it kind of goes back almost to the hero's journey in that Anakin impressionably wanted to become the savior of the galaxy and had these dreams that may have been prophetic through the Force or may have just been childhood imagination on fire about flying across the stars, and liberating people and being a galactic hero, and very much a messiah type character. But it seems that the Jedi who bucked the trend of wanting to fight on the front lines was seen as dissidents. And you could even say Count Dooku began that by perceiving some sort of corruption that isn't necessarily outlined on screen, but might well be in some of the extra material, such as Dooku Lost, which I have not read.
You need
The
to.
I do, or listen to if it's the drama.
It is. It's
Yeah.
a drama, and that's how you should listen to it. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. That if Count Dooku became so unsatisfied with how the Jedi Order were progressing, as well as the broader galactic political systems, that he thought, okay, I'm going to step away from this officially, become a member of the Lost 20, the 20 Jedi Masters who stepped away from the Jedi Order, and then started down his own journey. It did lead to the dark side. He was attempted by and corrupted by Palpatine, but he left the Jedi more or less how it seems in the films off his own accord from what little information we have. But if we go back to originally the top of the question, you've got the Jedi Order clashing with the Sith Empire numerous times, not just within the first great schism they had in terms of we're going to use the Force to bend to our will and acquire wealth and power was the Sith mindset. The Jedi mindset was more we are protecting peace and justice, but we surrender to the will of the Force and maybe obey the Force, and we are conduits of the Force. We do not use the Force as a tool, an instrument to gain things personally and selfishly, and certainly not as a weapon of war, which is very much what the Sith don't mind doing. And you even see that in the old video games, like the Jedi Knight series. All the defensive Force powers are neutral, light-sided, and all the attacking cool ones, the Force grips and the Force lightning, they are all channeling the dark side to give you a physical advantage over opponents, whether it's lightsaber combat or just anything else. So if we go back to including the expanded universe and the old Republic and the beginnings of the Jedi were conceived as a peaceful order, not specifically for war, but they had the knowledge of martial arts, the way of a warrior, and a militaristic level of discipline, but not necessarily to make war a part of their everyday identity, more part of their knowledge that when it came down to it and there was no other alternative, could be used as a final option, never as a first resort.
Yeah. Catherine?
Yeah, going back to what I said earlier, it's one thing if they need to fight their way out of a problem, but they're not really warriors by nature. That's one of the big mistakes that the prequels make, is they don't really specify why they go from, okay, I get you're leading a rescue mission on Geonosis, but that's like, okay, that doesn't really translate to them automatically being generals for everything else, because again, they could just have clones pre-programmed to be generals and following the basic ethical codes the Jedi would want them to follow. So, I mean, maybe I guess they're there, you could say, as representatives of the army when they get to planets that are like neutral and they're trying to convince them to join their cause, and it would be more helpful to have the powers that be interacting with the Jedi and negotiating with the Jedi as opposed to negotiating with this foreign army that's just shown up out of nowhere, which never existed before. But even then, that would still be the role of negotiator, wouldn't be the role of general. So that's admittedly something that I feel they could explore further in books or whatnot. But I think the willingness to eventually become generals is keyed more to the fact that, by the end of like this prequel trilogy takes place where they're at the end of their heyday, so to speak. They're already corrupted.
Yeah, is my take is I think in the Star Wars universe they're really loosey goosey on who they decide is a general. I mean, you immediately get like General Solo and General Calrissian and General Skywalker, the little Skywalker, immediately just declared, because, hey, we did something cool. We ran down, we blew up a Death Star. Hey, you're a general now. You helped us out. Thanks.
They did mention that Lando particularly was involved with the Battle of Tanab, so he was in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not my memory doesn't serve me off the top of my head as to what that exactly was, if that was like more of a skirmish or if that was part of an ongoing war. But he seems to have kind of you get the idea though that there was some nepotism there because Lando tells Han, "Hey, somebody must have told him about my maneuvers at the Battle of Tanab," and Han's like,
Yeah. Well, I think Skip in the comments here may have a really good take on this as well. Is they're declared generals to, morally destroy them, to lead them down a path that's different than what they really want to morally destroy them, Palpatine doing this, and maybe cause them to lose their connection to the Force because of this. Is that's why they're
Absolutely.
having a trouble, Force sensing, seeing the visions of what the Sith are doing and what Palpatine is up to, because they've been morally corrupted by this, role as military leaders. So.
Right, yeah, that's definitely the case in terms of why Palpatine promoted him to that purpose, because it's going to be easy to make them the scapegoats, because they're the ones who are more or less the face of the war. Because by using clones, that's another ingenious part of Palpatine's part is that people think of clones almost as if they're like robots, so they're going to think of the people, the real decision makers, more or less being the Jedi, and so that's kind of where that. And I guess to be fair, in the early Clone Wars seasons, most of the plots surround campaigns to try and win over neutral planets and maybe liberate ones that are currently under attack, as opposed to we're just going to go invade this random separatist holding and try and take it. But that still would be a fascinating thing to explore further. But I do think it's also their penchant for being so political and it being more of a political institution by the time of the prequel trilogy that makes them so much more eager to slip into that. Like, I don't think they would if it was like for much further back in the timeline, maybe even before the High Republic.
Right, and you see really, really quickly that, or really quickly in the Bad Batch, episode 1, I think, that the population, the populace of the galaxy in general, kind of accepts Order 66. They're like, oh, it's the Jedi's fault, as they did this. That's why we're having the clone army take out all the Jedi. They don't immediately go, why are you these peaceful monk guys? Why are you killing them all?
Well, remember, Palpatine didn't really have to lie because the Jedi were planning on removing him from power even before they found out what he said. They did confront him with their lightsabers drawn, trying to arrest him. They technically did try to kill him, even though, of course, he's not telling him the part about how, he ignited the saber and started killing them first. But that's kind of the neat thing in Star Wars also, is that the villains tend to get their way by telling the truth, whereas the heroes get their way by lying. And so it would be that much easier. So when he gives that big speech, as we saw, the fact that the Jedi had been apparently hacking into his security system, because Yoda and Obi-Wan go back to the temple and they're just able to pull up the hologram of Anakin kneeling before Palpatine, and it's like, okay, if they have access to that's something else Palpatine could use against them to say, hey, see, they're spying on me too, they're collaborating against me, and he could probably get access to, therefore by extension, all of the other Jedi secret meetings where they're discussing, we have a problem with Palpatine and he's been here too long, we need to do something about it. So that's probably all working in his favor as well, to turn people against them. And the fact that it is a bit like a broken record in some Clone Wars episodes where the Jedi are like, oh, we're going to come here, you'll be safe, and blah, blah, blah. And then eventually they'll come back to that same planet at some point later in the series. And it seems like it's just like this ongoing conflict and there's no real peace coming from it. So they could lose their faith in them even more.
Well, and that's the whole, it's cyclical in that, okay, we get rid of the Galactic Empire who's just grown up, and then magically again, oh, the New Republic is not respected at all. Oh, here's the First Order. Didn't we learn our lesson the first time? No.
Yeah, I admit that's something that's a bit odd. It's like, okay, so in the sequel trilogy, after the New Republic is blown to smithereens, they just want to build the Republic again. And it's like, wait a minute, this just failed. It failed like 30 years earlier when the Empire destroyed it, and then before that, it already failed at 1,000 years ago during the times of the Old Republic. So if this Republic thing clearly is not working, maybe focus more on liberating people and just everybody being safe. Because think about it. politically speaking, Confederacy of Independent Systems makes a lot more sense for the galaxy, because you're talking about trillions, if not quadrillions, of beings from all sorts of different cultures and backgrounds who are all being represented by just a few hundred senators. Like, that's insane. Like, even on Earth, in certain countries having those representatives that we have, it feels crazy that they're representing the sheer amount. Like, we have a country in the United States where you have like roughly 330 million people represented by just 4 people in Congress, which is insane to think of as well. And when you apply that on a whole galaxy level, the idea that they have to have like blanket laws for everybody to follow, that's obviously things are going to get lost in communication, so to speak, trying to translate things in different cultures. So that also like facilitates the cyclical nature. Like, do we really need to keep doing this? Whereas if they were to be these independent star systems and running their own little fiefdom, so to speak, with the republic being replaced with more like a United Nations type thing, then that would probably be a lot better for everybody and prevent corruption. Because the New Republic tried to combat corruption by having the capital shift to different planets I think it was every 5 years or something. So that way they'd be less likely to have this whole corrupt underbelly develop beneath it like you had on Coruscant.
So Gio said this at the beginning, so let's kind of switch to it. Let's talk real world parallels. I mentioned before we came on that I've been watching a really cool Netflix docudrama. I think it's called Dawn of the Samurai. I wouldn't swear to that. I'll look it up while you guys are talking. But it's a Netflix original, and it is the history of the samurai culture and the samurai leadership kind of taking over feudal Japan. So let's talk about what are real world parallels into this peacekeeper versus warrior. Go.
I would think a version of that would be like, as we mentioned on previous episodes, during the Inquisitions. Like, it was never really about religion. It was about getting rid of political dissidents and people they could perceive as a threat. But they put the religious people, the religious institutions like the Vatican, in charge of it, because religion being a powerful drug, so many people were so won over by it that, if the church says they're doing this for religious reasons, then it's okay, and people aren't going to fight it as much. But they're still very much having church leaders kind of lead what is very much a political movement, which is obviously a conflict of interest, much like you have with the Jedi leading the clone armies. That's one example.
Yeah.
There are so many. Let me try and think chronologically. The conflict between peacekeeping and warriors was almost a conflict within the human mind and psyche itself, because you could go into kind of yin yang kind of thinking. Is there mastery over the real world, physical, material things that we have, and then the mastery of oneself in a personal and spiritual way, as we've discussed before. Peacekeeping is very much more on the outside of it, something that is about maintaining tranquility and calm, whereas the warrior aspect is, of course, using physical means to enforce something, ideally for the protection and defense of freedom and the principles we've mentioned that the Jedi hold dear. And that is often the justification for various acts of violence and war throughout human history, across all of the human species, different civilizations, ancient empires and states and sovereign areas. Maybe the oldest real world one I can think of is the Athanatol, which I think is ancient Greek to mean the immortals, those who are timeless. So those were part of the Archimedean Empire. So Herodotus, one of the very first scholars to write down Western history, almost the great grandfather of definitely European history at least, described this kind of elite force that were both part of the standing army and a kind of higher imperial guard. And they kept the Persian infantry in line. They trained them. They were very skilled with war, but they were only brought out as a final resort when the Achaemenid Empire found they were, at threat of extinction. They weren't used as a battering ram for crusading and colonialism to kind of invade and conquer lands. Whereas and this is quite a few centuries ago. When you go forward through time and you look at the same area, when it came about to then the Greek Empire with Sparta, very famously with the very strong machismo warriors of Sparta that we see in 300, and they're fully in popular culture. That's very much about almost warrior idealism and the idolization of a soldier being the ultimate one's ultimate goal for a particular male in a particular substrata of the society. And the very best thing you could be is to go up the military ranks and be more influential and command a larger base of other men to fight for you and alongside with you on the battlefield. Interestingly, that's changed through human history as well. Now there's a much greater division of power, and those who are commanders and generals very rarely are side by side with those that they are instructing. And I guess this part of parallel in Star Wars too, because at the very least you see someone as senior as Obi-Wan Kenobi or Mace Windu, even Yoda, wielding their lightsaber within the Clone Wars themselves in actual small skirmishes and huge battles. But you'd never see that in modern military history, but you do see that a couple of centuries back. And I guess I was going to say the evolution of society, but it's not really evolved. It's kind of a backward move, because it's a lot more discriminating between people. But we could talk about the Crusades for hours. That's another famous example of a warrior ideal that is kind of subverted and used for nefarious means for colonialism and conquest.
I was going to say that's actually a very much adept analogy to make for Clone Wars would be the Crusades. Because on the one hand, yes, the people leading the Crusades were deeply religious and were very hot and bothered by the idea of the rival religion gaining more power. But it's still, at the end of the day, it was about, we don't want the enemy or the people who are different from us gaining more power and using that as justification to go to war. It's like the Ottoman Empire, for example, is one of the most peaceful empires ever, kept to itself for 600 years. And it was more so the colonial aggressors in the Crusades who kept, banging down the doors, so to speak.
Yeah.
So-called because of religious reasons, but it was really about, taking the land and taking what we can from the people, the others, so to speak. So that's another analogy you can make, but you're right. It sadly hasn't really evolved.
No, and I'll give you a real world right now, not hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, is the public perception of the police in the United States, and I would assume also in Great Britain, is public perception is the militarization and the up-armored tacticalness of that U.S. police forces. I mean, in England, famously, at least, by what we understand, is bobbies would normally just carry like a nightstick. I'm betting that's not really common anymore. They've got their lightsaber and that's all that they need to protect the peace. And no, because, we've gotten to the point, whether it's necessary or whether it's not necessary, that our police in this country are wearing bulletproof vests and tactical clothing all the time and are carrying multiple firearms and, has evolved from maybe the shotgun mounted to the roof of the cruiser to, AR-15s and our local police force here, and I live in a small town, has like armored personnel carriers. So that's going to lead to the perception of, are these people really peacekeepers? Are they becoming more and more like a small army?
They become more and more convinced that they are right and they are correct, and it's like that's this is for the better of other people, the betterment of the galaxy, if you will. Like every time, like again, going back to those first few seasons of Clone Wars, where you had so many plots where the Jedi were trying to convince a neutral planet to join them, and it's like, oh, we'll build a base and you'll have protection. But it's like, well, it was neutral before, and they weren't really under attack before. They were just getting counter offers from Republican separatists. So what are you really getting other than inviting this militaristic force to sort of militarize part of your everyday society, much like you had, say, in World War II, where you got in, the Americans went and set up all the, granted, in that case, it was necessary, setting up all the military bases in Britain, and how much that changed daily culture there as they're getting ready to invade Nazi Germany. And you saw the same thing eventually with the American military bases, still throughout Europe or in Okinawa and that throughout Japan, and how that's not really, it's like, yeah, we're here for peacekeeping, and we're here because, like in the Pacific War's case, we didn't want Japan to have a military after that. They can have a self-defense force, and we wanted to put down the more extremists in Japanese politics who still want to go back to the emperor system. But by and large, the people in Japan aren't really interested in that, yet they keep seeing that you have these American, all the soldiers everywhere, and they kind of feel, some of them feel a little bothered by it, because it's like, well, we could have our own military and deal with it ourselves, but we can't, simply because you're not allowing us to, because of a 75-year-old conflict that's, well in the rearview mirror. But it's like, you see how that could possibly negatively affect other societies, because you believe that, oh, you're right. Like, for example, the Soviet Union collapsed 30 years ago now. It's like, have we really needed those military bases throughout Western Europe and patrolling everywhere? And everybody's like, do we really need that? Or is it more like, oh, we're right, and this is what we need, and blah, 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 blah. And the Jedi are kind of doing the same thing in Clone Wars. They believe that they are absolutely right and correct. And so, yeah, let's go bother a bunch of star systems which are peaceful, keeping to themselves. In a sense, you're bringing the war to them, which I think was a point made very well by Duchess Satine in the various Mandalore arcs in Clone Wars, that she's like, look, we're not going to get involved in your war, because if we host either a separatist base or a Republic base, then we're just bringing the opposition to our doorstep. And we really don't want to deal with that. And so it is that thing where they, both sides are sort of mentally deluded, and that they think they're absolutely right and correct. Because really, one of the other frustrating things about Clone Wars is that they never really dive into what the political movement of the Separatists is all about. It's like, yes, we know that at the end of the day, it's a long con by Darth Sidious and Darth Tyrannus to overthrow the Republic and to start the Empire. But in season 3, you did get to see the Separatist Senate, which seemed to be comprised of like people who were actually caring and most likely kept in the dark about the atrocities the Separatists were committing on the battlefield. But what were their goals? What did they want? Like, even Padme asked Anakin in Revenge of the Sith, have you ever considered we might be on the wrong side? Because she's kind of on the outs. She's not really in, the cult, so to speak, of, like Anakin, of course, he's been fighting for that cause his whole life. Or not his whole life, but for, he's been in the Jedi Order for 13 years by that point. So, of course, he's going to fight for the Jedi, not dare question any of it, even though when Padme asked the Chancellor to step in and let diplomacy resume, and he's like, oh, don't ask me to do that. Make that question the Senate where it belongs. I'm like, excuse me, that's the absolutely right thing to do. And you do have the Chancellor's ear. So that is absolutely the right, appropriate, avenue to take. But because he's so, brainwashed into it, like a lot of the other Jedi are at that point, they're not going to dare question it. Like, even another good example of that would be throughout the Clone Wars, the Jedi Council keeps getting all these hints that the Dark Lord of the Sith is at work doing something. And they keep taking the wait and see approach, because they're so confident in their chosen one. They're so confident in their, oh, we're right, everything's worked out fine, but that nothing bad's going to happen. And then you see how that turns out.
So we're getting towards the end here, so I'm going to ask for final thoughts, and I'll go first. On Jedi, warriors, or keepers of the peace. And I'm going to go with both, using my real-world example and some examples from the Jedi. Is, I think, as an institution, the Jedi have become warriors that we have seen in canon. Is as an institution, the whole thing, they have become a warrior organization.
Yeah.
And I'll go with right back to the police force as well. I think quite possibly to deal with trials and tribulations of this society is that's happened to a lot. But I currently and personally know a number of police officers who are like, the samurai. When I put on my bulletproof vest and my weapon and I go out there in the public, is this is the way that I have to be, I project this strength and this power. But, many of these guys are very caring fathers and grandfathers, and, have their hobbies that the scheduling affords them. One of my best buds is He's a collector of Star Wars toys and other toys in his free time. I'm
Yeah.
working 4 10s, but I got the rest of the time to go out there and pick for Star Wars toys. You see the same kind of thing with the samurai, which would be, they're warriors, but they're warrior poets. Is when I'm not fighting a battle, I'm a gardener, or I write poetry, or I'm a painter, an artist. Is that sort of thing, but the organization has become the warrior culture, and that. Yet, in their own minds, in their own lives, I think many Jedi who would take that sabbatical, like, Yoda would take a sabbatical in the High Republic now to just teach younglings, and many of the other ones, would go off and have their own path. So I'm going to go with both, and it's the organization as opposed to the individual. Catherine?
I would say also both, but if you were to ask the Jedi straight to their faces, they would never consider themselves warriors because they're so, again, drunk on their own Kool-Aid. They're gonna come up with a defense for it every step of the way. And I think the primary defense they would use in the Clone Wars, if somebody asked them point blank, you're becoming warriors, what's this all about? Is, oh, but the enemy is led by the Sith, and therefore it is a Jedi conflict more than it is a political conflict. But you see the problems there as well, like in the season 1, episode 10, Lair of Grievous, where Kit Fisto is reunited with his apprentice Nadar, who's become very violent and much darker in that way. Because on the one hand, you're being taught pacifism, but then you're being thrown on the battlefield and being asked to do the complete opposite. And I thought Nadar was a more realistic example of what the Jedi younglings would have been like in that war. And you can imagine that if Order 66 hadn't happened, just how messed up the next generation of Jedi would have been. So I think in that way, yes, if you asked them to their faces, they would never opine that they are warriors. They would always come up with an excuse. And they definitely believe themselves a spiritual movement, and once upon a time they were a spiritual movement, but by the time of the prequels they've sort of regressed to being more about warriors and getting too sucked into that whole ideology.
And Gio?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a blend of both, but depending on where you look at in the Star Wars saga and the storylines, even within the actual films alone, the kind of balance of percentages, if it's one end is peacekeeping and one is warrior and they're opposites, overall it should be kind of 50-50 from what we know of the Jedi. But what we see on screen, definitely in the era we've talked most about, the Clone Wars, where we have more depth, it definitely seems it would probably be maybe 20-80 peacekeeping versus warrior. But how much of that is due to internal corruption, institutionalization, brainwashing, and indoctrination? All things that the Jedi spiritually would be totally against. But as a almost a political, socio-political, religious body and institution that is part of a gigantic corrupt republic, has fallen away from that completely. So they are more inclined to see themselves as, okay, we are this side, and we must do A, B, and C for the galaxy, and we must also do X, Y, and Z to eliminate the omnipresent threat of the Sith wherever they may be. But the conflict for a Jedi and for a warrior generally is a lot more internal, a lot more metaphysical and spiritual than simply let's ignite our saber, draw our sword, and cut down the enemy in the name of peace.
And how much more of that 80-20 that we've seen in canon and in the saga is just simply due to the fact that we're not going to go watch a 2-hour movie of Jedi sitting, meditating, and doing their paintings and creating poems and tending their garden. We want to see the lightsaber battles. So, at some point, it may, that's cinematography and what's going to be exciting to see on screen.
Yeah.
They color what we've been shown.
Yeah. Well, yeah, action
With that,
does
I do
speak
actually
loudest.
have to go, so
All right.
I will see you guys later.
All right, Catherine, and we are wrapping it up as well, as we are a few minutes over, but I think as we've pointed out several times during this is a part 2 of a really huge topic that we could create a part 3 and a part 4 and a part 5 of, and hopefully we will see that later on in different episodes of this. So, friends, thank you for joining us again for the Unifying Force. I know it is very early for some of you on here, and it's taking time out of your Sundays. Please don't forget that we've got some really cool stuff coming up in the Virtual Cantina Network at large. Stop by our TeePublic site. You know, there's new shirts up. If you look in the Facebook group, there are a number of new sister groups that are coming off. We've got new shows coming out. The Celebrating Autograph show is coming up. All sorts of things in the new racing shirt. If you love the old racing shirt, the one that we did in March, there's a new one that's going to come out for Celebration, so everyone can know that you are a member of this group and spot you, you know, from across the convention. Check out all of those things and join us again for the next episode of the Unifying Force. I think we're off for a couple of weeks because this month has a fifth Friday in it, so we're not going to have a Sunday show on the fifth Friday, but we will have another show back for you on the first Friday of November. And so see you guys all then, and may the Force be with you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Please join us again. We're on YouTube and Facebook, so notifications are available aplenty for when we're next doing things. So please stay tuned, and thanks for giving us some of your Sunday. And this is the way. May the Force be with you all.